Hi, Krista Smith here. Are your leadership days chock full of problem solving, both for you and for your team? Do you feel like every single problem is even more complex and more challenging than the one before it? If so, stick with me and we will go over something that's very important to understand and recognize in your decision-making and problem-solving journey as a leader, both for you and for your team. If you're new here, I'm Krista Smith, and I'm on a mission to help ambitious women thrive as leaders by sharing what I've learned and am still learning as an executive, a lifelong optimizer, and a beauty school wannabe. Stick with me. So if you're like me, you probably have the feeling that every problem that faces you and your team and your company is even more complex than the last one. If you feel that way, you're not alone, and the reason is probably because it actually is more complex than all the ones before it. We live in an incredibly complex world, and the things that are coming at us are really, really challenging to address. And I want to introduce this concept called polarity management. So often, when we're faced with a challenge, we do not have a problem to be solved that we're never going to have to think about again, but rather we have a polarity to be managed. And what that means is that there are upsides and there are downsides to any decision that's facing us. And that is so true with so many things in the world. And the first step at problem solving is to recognize that in reality, we're not solving a problem at all. There's a great book written on this concept called Polarity Management by Barry Johnson. I had the privilege of taking a class with Barry and even learning the content and being able to reteach it to others. I highly recommend the book, both for a read and then for a reference whenever you and your team are faced with these types of really complex issues. Now, in order to illustrate this concept, let's go through a few classic polarities. First is, how do we organize our company or our organization? Do we group people in our organization by function or by project? Now, most of you can intuitively see, or if you've lived it, you absolutely know by concrete fact, that there are upsides and there are downsides to both of these organizational structures. In a functional organization where everybody's organized by function, there is great synergy between people doing the same type of thing. There's a great home base for people. You're able to build expertise in your teams because people doing like work are organized together. Conversely, for companies that are organized based on a projectized structure, that's based on the project work that they're doing, you get great team synergy and you have people truly focused on whatever outcome they're working together to achieve. There's great bonding and great unity among a team there, and you get great interdisciplinary interactions between those teams. Of course, there's challenges to both of these structures too. One challenge of the projectized organization is, what home do people go to once that project is over? Because by the very nature of a project has a beginning and an end. And when the project ends, where do the people go? And if you don't have your work coming in a perfect way to where you have a new project starting every time you have an existing project winding down, then really quickly you're going to have a challenge with how to deploy and maintain resources. Conversely, in a functional area, in order for people to do work, people don't do work based on functions unless they're just doing process improvements for that function itself. In general, people need to be on multidisciplinary teams in order to do work. So in a purely functional organization, what you have to do is you have to start matrixing employees into projects so that then the employees have hopefully a home base and hopefully functional expertise that they're then able to bring to the project. And then, though, the downside is that you're faced with the challenges of a matrixed organization. And that is that the reporting lines of communication and of hierarchy get incredibly complex. Every person has two masters. They have their functional master, and then they have their projectized or their matrix master or boss. They have their functional team, and then they have their matrixed team. And so it can make employees and leaders feel like they're spending a ton of their time just trying to communicate, maintain relationships, and keep the connections alive. As you can see in this classic example, one choice isn't perfect, functional or projectized. Rather, what we have is a polarity to be managed regardless of the choice that we make. When we're faced with a polarity like this, there's a few things that we need to do. But before we talk about the things that we need to do, let me give you an example of another great classic polarity, and that would be training for a really tough athletic event, let's say a triathlon. You can rest a whole lot, or you can train really, 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 really hard. Now, if you rest too much, you can see that there are some downsides to that, and that is that you won't be ready for whatever the challenge is and whatever the race is, whatever the context is. If you train really, 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 really hard, you can see that there's downsides to that training, and that is that you might have injury. And you might work so hard that you won't be able to train anymore, and you'll be knocked off your game and not able to compete in whatever the challenge is. There's, of course, upsides to both of these sides of the polarity. If you rest, that way you're preserving your physical strength, you're keeping your wellness up, you're avoiding injury. Conversely, on the side where we are training really, really hard, we're going to be getting stronger. We're going to be getting better. We are going to really be prepping physically for whatever that contest is. Pretty soon in this scenario, you can see that it's not all or nothing, and that we need to work to figure out how to achieve the best of both worlds. Those are two examples of polarities. Let's jump into what you do when you identify that you have a polarity. There are three things, at least, that you should do anytime that you recognize that you have a polarity. The first one, and the most important, is recognize that you have a polarity to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. That will help get your mindset and your mental models in the right place so that you and your team can address the challenges in front of you. After you've identified that you are in a polarity situation, then what you want to do is you want to identify what are the upsides of each side of the polarity and what are the downsides of each side of the polarity. Finally, the third step is that you want to brainstorm and come up with scenarios that allow you to capture the upsides to the greatest extent possible of each side of the polarity. Of course, I have explained this here in just a few minutes. This is incredibly complex and challenging. It does allow you, though, to start addressing some of the real challenges that are in front of us in a more productive way than thinking that it's a decision and a problem to be solved. Rather, we have to look at what are the different extremes of the decisions that are in front of us and how do we work to get the upsides of both of those decisions. One other thing that's true with polarities is that they always need to be managed. You're never done working to try to achieve the upsides of the polarities and minimize the downsides of the poles of the polarities. Once we know that we're always going to be in a situation in whatever the subject matter is to where we're always going to need to have some attention and some eyes on it, then we can move in and identify early warning signs that something's going off the rails. We can identify measures and metrics that allow us to predict if something's going off the rails or if we're not doing a great job at achieving the upside of both sides of that polarity. The key, though, is to recognize that we're in a polarity situation, not a problem-solving situation. There are some warnings that I like to think about when I'm dealing with the complexities of my days. Pendulums tend to swing back and forth. We take for granted our tailwinds, the things that are helping us because we're sitting in this side of the polarity. And we really experience all those negatives and they're just drawing on us and weighing us down. And then we look over to the other side of the polarity and we see the upsides of that. And we say, oh, that's going to be so fabulous to not have to have all these negatives, all these downsides of the current situation that we're in. What we don't usually do, though, is take the time to recognize the downsides of the other choice and the other model. This is a very complex subject. We can absolutely talk more about it. Please leave in the comments section how you think about polarities, how you deal with them in your leadership journey, and what recommendations you have for our little community here. If this is something that's interesting to you and you would like for us to discuss it more, I would be thrilled to go in even deeper and help us all learn more about this concept of polarities and of discussing how we might be able to work to find solutions that help to achieve the upsides of both ends of those poles. I hope that this content is helpful to you. If it is, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel. I do drop new content every Friday at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you know any other fabulous ladies on their leadership journey that might also find this content helpful, I would love for you to share this channel with them so that we can build our community and together become stronger, more capable, more confident leaders. Have a great week.